If you're like many anxiety sufferers, you might have been told or even led to believe that your anxiety is due to a chemical imbalance in your brain. When you have anxiety, that can be convincing because anxiety can feel like it's something out of your control and something that you are probably even stuck with. But here's the thing. For an overwhelming majority of people suffering from anxiety, this isn't true and it's not supported by science. So in this episode, we're going to dive into why anxiety is not a chemical imbalance and what that means for your recovery journey. Let's begin. All right, so back in the 1960s and 70s, researchers proposed something called the serotonin hypothesis. This theory suggested that mental health conditions like depression and anxiety were caused by low levels of serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter in your brain. Working off this idea, pharmaceutical companies developed medications like SSRIs, such as Zoloft and Lexapro, which increase your serotonin levels. Over time, this theory became mainstream. And so today, anxiety is often looked at as a chemical imbalance in your brain. Again, the thought process here is that you're not getting enough serotonin, and so these SSRI drugs can help fix that by introducing more serotonin. But the science doesn't actually support that. In fact, Forbes published an article on how scientists are now disproving this theory. The article discusses how medical science has never been able to prove that anxiety is due to an imbalance or any type of inherited condition. In fact, on the contrary, they show that despite widespread use of SSRIs, rates of anxiety aren't improving. From 1990 to 2010, anxiety disorders have stayed right around 4% globally. And if that's not enough, evidence is showing that SSRIs perform no better than placebos do when they're given to people suffering from anxiety. But as we know, once a theory becomes mainstream, it becomes really tough to shift public opinion on it. Right now, there is this widespread belief that anxiety is due to a chemical imbalance and that the only way to treat it is by medications. And so that's the approach that doctors take on anxiety. Now, to be clear, we have fantastic doctors in this country, and they're some of the best people around. But you need to understand that doctors are quote unquote practicing medicine, just like an attorney is practicing law. As doctors, their job is to help to try to remedy illnesses and ailments through medicine. And so that's why when you tell your doctor about your anxiety, he or she is extremely likely to pull out a prescription pad and give you a prescription for anxiety medication. So I don't want you to be surprised by that. That's the remedy that they're taught to provide. Okay, let's talk about the problems associated with anxiety being seen as a chemical imbalance. The first problem is that we end up putting a label on ourselves as having an anxiety disorder. In other words, we've adopted this label that something's physically wrong with us. The second problem is that because we view it as a chemical imbalance in your brain, we see medication as the only route to fix it. And this makes sense because if it is a chemical imbalance in your brain, that'd be something that'd be really tough to change through lifestyle changes or behavioral changes. Okay, so if anxiety isn't a chemical imbalance, what is it? Well, going back to the Forbes article, they talk about how anxiety is not a medical issue, but rather an environmental issue. And they point to how globally, anxiety affects about 1 in 14 people. But in places where there's a lot of war or conflict, it's around 1 in 5. Now, that's a massive increase. And so what they say is that anxiety has nothing to do with a chemical imbalance, but it's rather a natural response to adversity and heightened stress. That's exactly what happened to me. When my anxiety started, I had a lot going on. I had just finished law school and final exams. I proposed to my now wife, Melanie. I was studying for the bar exam, planning to move halfway across the country, and looking for a house as I was going to begin a new job. So needless to say, I had a ton going on. And that's when I had my first panic attack. It was all this pressure and adversity going on in my life that led me to that first panic attack. And from there, I instantly became fearful of having another panic attack because, quite frankly, I didn't know what was happening to me. And then from there, I started having more panic attacks and then began to have constant waves of anxiety, derealization, and all sorts of scary sensations. So I thought something was seriously wrong with me, and I became terrified. Now, my doctor quickly diagnosed me with an anxiety disorder and a panic disorder, but the medications that he prescribed didn't help. So I was just stuck suffering day in and day out with endless anxiety. But here's the thing. After nearly 2 years of suffering from anxiety, I learned that I'd fallen into this mental cycle and this behavior pattern that had kept me trapped with anxiety. And this is exactly what happens to each and every person suffering from anxiety. We fall into this cycle where we become afraid of our anxiety, and that fear creates more anxiety. And we go around and around as our anxiety becomes worse and worse. But there is some great news. And the great news is that recovering involves focusing on some very simple principles that allow us to change our behavior pattern and get out of this cycle. That's exactly how I recovered and how I now mentor clients to completely overcome their anxiety. I've put the framework and the principles in the link below. It's called the 5-Step Cure to Anxiety and Panic Attacks, and it's completely free. It'll show you the outline for the process that I use to recover and that I use with my clients. If you have any questions, reach out in the comments below and I'll be sure to get back to you. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next one.